screen. My name is Alistair Seaman. It's my privilege to chair our session this afternoon. I've been a lifelong follower of Jesus, a lifelong environmentalist, and I'm the climate change manager at Keep Scotland Beautiful environmental charity. Just some quick housekeeping, please. First, your mic was muted on entry, so if you can please keep your mic muted for the next part of the session, so we can make sure we can hear all of our speakers clearly. This event is also being live streamed on Facebook, and it will be recorded. So if you're uncomfortable about having your face appear in any of those recordings, then please feel free to switch your camera off. Just a quick overview of what's happening. We've planned this session to allow lots of discussion, and that will happen in two main ways. After our three speakers have spoken, there will be an opportunity for an open question and answer. So the way we'll do that, given there are so many of us here, is if you've got a question, then please, as the question comes to mind, and we'll compile those questions, and then once all three panelists have spoken, we'll have a time for an open question and answer, and we'll try to get through as many of those as we can. After the Q&A session, we'll also have time in small groups to give you an opportunity also to share some of your own experiences, your questions and your ideas with like-minded friends. And then we'll come back for a short wrap-up, which will include hearing about some of the great resources that our organising partners have to help Christians and churches act on the issue of climate justice. I've had the privilege of living and working in both Africa and Asia, including actually for Tearfund, one of our host organisations this afternoon. And I've seen the impact of extreme weather on poor people and communities firsthand. I'll never forget visiting a small village on the border of Nepal and India a few years ago, just after it had burnt to the ground. It was still smoking when I arrived. A spark from a cooking pot had caught a grass thatched roof, and following an extremely hot and dry spell with a hot, dry wind, the village burnt down in a matter of half an hour. Everything was destroyed. Fortunately, no loss of life, but all possessions gone, and including the hard-earned savings of a couple of migrant workers from that village who'd returned home after a year of labouring in very difficult conditions in India the night before with their cash savings, and that was all gone. 3 months later, just as villagers were starting to get their lives back together again, that village was under 3 feet of water after an unusually heavy monsoon. And I've been kind of watching the news in Asia this year, and these tragedies play out every week around our world, but they rarely make it into our news feeds. We know that climate change is going to increase the frequency of these disasters, and we know that those who suffer most seriously are those who've done least to cause the problem. So we're here today with 3 fantastic guests to help us understand this issue better, and not just to understand it, but to know what Christians and churches can do about it. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first guest this afternoon, and we're delighted to be joined by Father Leonard Chitty, who joins us this afternoon all the way from Johannesburg. Father Chitty was recently appointed as provincial head of the Jesuits in Southern Africa. He's well known in his native Zambia as a campaigner against poverty and injustice, and holds degrees in development studies as well as in theology. He's worked with the Scottish Catholic International Aid Fund, SCIAF, also one of our organising partners today, for many years, and he serves on their Integral Human Development Committee. He's no stranger to Scotland, having met with representatives from political parties in the Scottish Parliament to lobby for climate justice, and he's played an important role in campaigning for Scotland to enshrine tough climate targets into legislation. So Father Chitty, thank you so much for joining us. A very warm welcome virtually to Scotland and to our meeting. The floor is now yours to share your perspective on what Christians and churches here in Scotland can do about climate justice. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Alistair, and hello everyone. And let me say thank you very much for this opportunity to be part of this very important meeting. I've been asked to give an international perspective to the impact of climate change on frontline communities. I must say, listening to Alistair, I wondered whether I should go ahead and speak about my own experience in this part of the world, particularly highlighting the experience of many communities in a part of Malawi called Chikwawa, which is in the southern part of Malawi, along the Shira River, which is a very important river in Malawi, which supports subsistence farming, as well as providing water supplies to the local people. 2 years ago, there was a cyclone called Cyclone Idai that swept much of Southern Africa. And the people who live in that part of Malawi saw their homes washed away because the banks of the river burst and the whole area was flooded. So the homes that they lived in were washed away. The crops that they had planted that year were lost because of the flooding. And of course, people found themselves out in the open. All their properties, their meager properties were washed away. And on top of that, many people died. Up to about 50 people were reported to have died in that event. Clearly, many people attributed to the cyclone to climate change. So climate change is real for many people, particularly poor people. So what I thought I could do is, because we know the science, we know what causes climate change and what our role in it is. We know the impact on communities, particularly the effects on poorer communities. So I was just thinking that since I'm addressing brothers and sisters who share the same faith with me, that maybe I could do a little theological reflection. And to do that, I thought of a passage in Exodus chapter 3, where God is addressing Moses and saying, I've looked at the situation of my people in Egypt. I've seen their suffering, and now I mean to go and do something to alleviate them, and I want you to be my servant. It would seem to me that looking at the impact of climate change on communities in Malawi, in South Asia, and in many other parts of the world, that I think the Lord is saying something similar to us. He's saying, I've seen the suffering of my people, and some of this suffering is coming out of human activities over the last several decades, and I mean to go and help them. So I think that the Lord could be saying that to us in the same way he said that to Moses. One of the things I find very frustrating personally is because of my recent past and the work that I've been involved in, is I've been to many, many meetings, big meetings. I attended the COP21, even though I wasn't a delegate, but I was there in Paris. And there were so many political commitments that were made. An agreement was signed, and there were certain promises that were made, notably that funds will be made available to those who need to rebuild their lives on account of having suffered negatively because of climate change. It's 5 years down the line. And if I look at that community I spoke about in Chikwawa and other communities, those commitments that were made in Paris have not translated into any real concrete action. So it would seem to me that the Lord is once again reminding us of our responsibilities to join him in alleviating the suffering of the people. I'm a Jesuit. One of the things that we do as Jesuits on a yearly basis is we stop and ask ourselves 3 questions. The first question is, what have I done for Christ? Second question is, what am I doing for Christ? And the third question is, what ought I to do for Christ? So if I removed the term Christ, I hope I'm not blaspheming here, but if I removed that and replaced it with the poor, it will go something like, what have I done for poor people who suffered because of climate change? What am I currently doing? What ought I to do? Now, I recognize that many of us, especially listening to Alistair, we are already doing something, and we plan to do something, especially for those of us who live in Scotland, the UK. We know that in November, we'll have another COP meeting, and there'll be many people from around the world. There'll be fine speeches, there'll be wonderful commitments, there will be agreements signed. But will this just end at signing agreements, making political proclamations, and very little would, come down to the people that need the help the most. Many of us Catholics, we pay attention to what our Pope Francis says about many things. And 5 years ago, he authored an important document on caring for the environment. One of the first things that he asks us to do in that document is to undergo an ecological conversion. So I might ask myself, have I really undergone an ecological conversion? Have I recognized my role in contributing towards the earth warming and therefore leading to climate change? The next thing that the Pope says in that document is that the poverty and the environment crises that we face are not two separate crises. They're one and the same. Therefore, any interventions or any intentions or any activities that we want to undertake to try and help the poor should also include doing something about climate change. So I'm really here not to tell you about the negative effects of climate change around the world. I'm not even here to tell you that you should do something about it. I think I'm just here to say that if we listen to God today, I think God is asking us, like Moses, to go and meet the people that are suffering and to cooperate with God to alleviate their sufferings. Now, it may not mean all of us traveling to some poor community in some faraway part of the world. It could start with where we are. It could start with me as an individual. What am I doing to reduce the carbon emissions that contribute to global warming? Am I considering playing a part in reforming the laws of my own country, like has been happening in Scotland, to ensure that we reach zero carbon emissions by a certain date? Am I acting in solidarity with others who share a similar passion for change? Am I reaching out to those who are indeed suffering in a very, very serious way, like the community in Malawi that I referenced, like the community that Alistair referenced in Nepal and South Asia? So I just thought maybe it's an opportunity to just remind ourselves as disciples and followers of Christ that we cannot afford to stand by and watch people suffer when we know that we can do something to contribute towards helping the poor, and as Pope Francis says, helping to restore our common home. I think I'll stop here, and I thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Father Chitty, for sharing. It's lovely and so important for us to hear directly from our brothers and sisters in the global south who are already experiencing the impacts of climate change in such significant ways. Just a reminder, there will be an opportunity shortly to ask Father Chitty a question. So if you have something that you'd like to ask him, prompted by what he shared, then please do post that into the Zoom question and answer box at the bottom of the screen before you forget. And I think there's a really nice link into our next two speakers who will talk a little bit about perhaps what some of that so what for us, what can we do practically here in Scotland is. So I'm delighted to welcome our next speaker, who is Seanit Knox from Inverclyde. Seanit's an elder in St John's Church in Gourock, is actively involved at the moment in the campaign to get the Church of Scotland to divest from its investment in fossil fuels. She's a member of the Church of Scotland's Carbon Net Zero Working Group, working to help the Church of Scotland become a net zero carbon church. And she's also been involved in Christian Aid's campaign to stop the UK government supporting fossil fuel extraction in developing countries. So Seanit, welcome. We're glad you're able to join us, and the virtual mic is now yours.
Hi everyone, I'm going to share my screen with you as I've got a wee presentation while I am chatting. So there you go. So I will start the presentation if I can get it up now. Okay, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to talk a wee bit this afternoon about why my faith inspires my activism in this area particularly, and also what churches can do and us as individuals for climate justice. So to kind of start, For me personally, and I'm sure for many of us, when I was growing up, one of the first kind of stories I learned about was the creation story. And as I've grown up in the church, though, despite it being something that you learn a lot about as a child within the church, I feel it's not something that we, draw on an awful lot as an adult. Certainly when in any kind of adult church spaces I've been in, it's not something that we regularly talk about. But for me, it is a really pivotal place to start when I think about my faith activism. Because, when you drill down into the creation story, we learn about how different aspects of the universe were created at different times to ensure they could sustain one another, and that interdependence doesn't just relate to ecosystems and weather patterns, but to us as humans as well. And, we often consider ourselves as stewards of God's creation and how we are called to make use of the land in a way that furthers God's kingdom here on earth. But, we are not perfect. And, we know that through our behaviours and our actions, that has often led to, degradation and damaging God's creation, which is, particularly hurting our siblings in Christ in the global south. And when I think also of the verses about the forbidden fruit and the tree of knowledge, I think it's often used to teach obedience, but I would challenge you to maybe next time you think about it, to read it as God telling us that there are things in the natural world that are not intended for humans. And as a climate justice activist and a Christian, I really see the Christian story as a message that not all things on this earth are meant for our consumption, and that consuming the wrong things can be harmful, if not fatal, particularly, as we said, for our siblings in Christ in the global south. And that, just because we can consume something does not mean that we need to do that. And I think as well, I often consider Jesus to be one of the first social justice activists. And, if we want to live the Jesus way, we really need to be outspoken when we see injustices. And Jesus particularly didn't wait until people were ready to hear what he had to say, or when it was financially viable. And, as Christians, we are inspired to walk the Jesus way and to take action when it's needed. But not necessarily when there's room for it or people are ready for it. We need to take bold action now. And I do think that we are called to do that. So moving on to what churches can do and what's our role, I think it's important to recognise the role of young people in the climate justice movement, and that young people are a great resource that churches should really draw on, because there's so much passion there. And I've been very fortunate that I've been able to use that passion to help the Church of Scotland and to try and effect some positive change. And there's lots and lots of research that's coming out, including some from Tearfund recently, about how young people are really, really worried about climate change, but they don't see that action to change anything in churches or even in governments. So I think it's a call to us of, right, these are a group of people who are so passionate and desperate to make a change. How can we empower them and help them? And through Christian Aid's prophetic activist scheme that I was a member of, I had a real opportunity to run a campaign alongside other young Christians in the UK to call on the UK government to stop the use of UK export credits to support the extraction of fossil fuels overseas, because it is completely at odds with the language we're using in the UK about switching to greener, cleaner, renewable energy. And it relates straight to, that's all well and good if the UK is doing that, but if we're also then spending money harming the planet and the global south and extracting resources from those people, and not helping those communities, then it's completely at odds with one another. And as a church, we should be really vocal about that. As I say, from a Church of Scotland context, I've been involved in trying to move the church to divest from fossil fuels, and I'm now part of a working group to help us move towards being carbon net zero. And so it's just about involving young people in those kind of conversations and those decision making. And ultimately, the Church of Scotland's at a position right now where before we can really run on this, we need to take stock of what our impact is. So churches need to do that. They need to assess, you know, what their operations are like and where changes can be made to make it more eco-friendly and hopefully eventually, obviously, carbon net zero. And I think as well, churches are at different stages on this. The Church of Scotland's a bit behind. Other churches in the UK and in Scotland are a bit more further ahead with this. So I suppose we also need to share good practice together and work together, not just you know, across denominations, but also maybe on an interfaith basis, because we do know that, you know, individually it makes a difference, but not as much as if we do it collaboratively and working together. So I think that's really, really important. On a congregational level, I think sometimes churches sometimes worry that, as I say, that their impact won't make a huge difference. But if every congregation is thinking about it and doing it, then, you know, collectively it's making a big difference. And it can be as simple as thinking about, you know, when you organise church events, where is the food that we're getting coming from? Is it local? Or and how much food waste are we then generating? What are we doing with that? A lot of churches are obviously now starting to look at what heating they use and how energy efficient their buildings are. But even churches, you know, can work in the local community with community groups to you know, reduce food waste, support active travel, and, you know, protect green spaces and maybe make those green spaces better for the community, either by growing food or whatnot. So there's lots of things churches on a local level can also do, I think. There are some organisations that are obviously quite helpful and got good resources. I know we're going to hear about Eco Congregation Scotland later on, so I'll kind of move on to briefly chat about like Operation Noah. They're a group who work with all Christian denominations and support interfaith work on climate change. They've got Bible study resources and things for churches to draw upon. They've got their own campaigns they run. So their website might be a really good place for some churches to explore some things they could do to get the ball rolling. Churches could also take part in Climate Sunday, which is an initiative encouraging congregations to hold a Climate Sunday anytime during the 12 months, and it started in September last year. And you know, that can be about holding a climate focused service, and you know, praying about climate and for COP26, and also committing to action as a local church and what you can do to have an impact, and ultimately to join the call to the UK government and the Scottish government to take bolder action on climate change in advance of COP26. And obviously, hopefully thereafter, and to strengthen our credibility to lead the international community to adopt a step change in action at COP26. Speaking of COP26, I also wanted to highlight the Scottish Church's COP26 pledge. I will put a little link to that in at the end once I've finished, but that's a pledge that got launched recently, and more than 50 church leaders have already signed the pledge, including the Bishop of Edinburgh, the leader of the Iona community, and the head of Christian Aid Scotland. Some church signatories of the pledge include Dunscore Parish Church, Stirling Methodist Church, and St Mary's Episcopal Cathedral in Edinburgh. It can be signed by individuals, churches, and Christian organisations at all levels. And you know, we would really hope that more individuals and church leaders across the denominations will sign it ahead of COP26. But to reflect back on the start of my presentation, I also think worship and how we think about creation and God can help change attitudes in our way of thinking when it comes to the environment. Theologian Sam Wells talks about being with creation in one of his books, and you know, he talks about the fact that when we talk about creation and think about it, we often think of it as us being made in the image of God and then having dominion over the earth, rather than thinking about us being alongside creation and the earth, you know, not first of all its owner or controller or conqueror, but its companion, and that we need one another to sustain one another, but we have often not behaved that way towards the earth. And when discussing the ecological crisis, Sam Wells says the balance between what humankind believes is for its own use and what it recognises as things simply to be enjoyed needs to change. And that's where he says worship could really help facilitate that change. And you know, it's all about taking a different approach to the things we use, including the things we often don't see or touch. It helps us truly appreciate what God has provided for us. And it forces us to consider what God had not intended for us, and how our unwillingness to relinquish these resources will only fragment our relationship with creation and ultimately hurt our siblings in Christ across the world, particularly those from the poorer communities in the global south, who we already know are suffering the effects of climate change now. Too many times we think because we're not directly facing the harsh effects of it now that it will happen soon, but it's not happening soon for others. It's affecting them right now. And we know as well that climate change intensifies all the other inequalities people face. So, climate justice is, gender justice and racial justice, and all these other things are kind of lumped into one, that we really need to, why it's so important we take action on it now and don't delay. So to just kind of conclude, my encouragement to everyone is to just reflect on the fact that God made this world with us in mind, but not for us, and how we as the church and as individuals treat creation tells a story about how we see ourselves in God's kingdom. Are we complicit in its destruction, or will we take a stand to help it heal? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shauna. My goodness, what a lot for us to reflect on. And it's interesting how both you and Father Chitty, I guess, challenge us theologically as well as practically. So if you've been prompted, if you've got a question or just a comment, please, again, do use that chat box feature, and we'll have a chance to come back and ask Shauna and all our panelists questions shortly. So our final speaker this afternoon is Laura Young from Glasgow. Laura is a climate activist, an ethical influencer, an environmental scientist, and a Christian. She currently works for Tearfund, again, one of our host organisations this afternoon, as their Scotland COP26 advocacy and campaigns coordinator. And in a role with Tearfund, Laura is involved in helping Christians and the church to put their faith into action on the topic of climate justice. So great to have you with us, Laura. Laura also promotes sustainability through her online presence under the name of Less Waste Laura, sharing her knowledge and experience from working in this sphere. She's based at Adelaide Place Baptist Church in Glasgow and sits on the Baptist Union of Scotland's Public Theology Group. So Laura, thank you again for making time to join us this afternoon. Welcome, and the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much. It's been so wonderful to already hear so many great things. And first of all, it's just an encouragement that we are all sitting here on a Zoom call on a sunny, I know we finally got the sun out and we're sitting on Zoom. Well, at least it is in Glasgow where I am, but I just want to say a massive thank you. I've been asked to kind of come and finish off this afternoon's speaking parts by bringing in that element of what we can do as an individual and how my faith has inspired my journey as a climate activist, as someone who's interested in living environmentally. And I want to first say that actually God has always been working through my activism, but my journey to being a climate activist and environmental activist didn't start in the church. I don't know if we're allowed to say that, but it didn't. I actually studied geography and environmental science and just learned about the world and fell in love with it. And then I think we all started to watch Blue Planet, felt guilty because David Attenborough was telling us off, and then really started to learn a bit more about the impacts of climate change. But as I journeyed with this and struggled with this and tried to become an activist, that's when I actually started to piece together what we've already heard. You know, we read the creation story in a totally different way. We read it in the way that is not just this lovely Sunday school story, but is actually a story of us being given responsibility for this home that we have, the beautiful sunny home that we have. And we also start to read the Bible in a totally different light, or we read it through a different lens, a lens that is one of not just creation care, but is also a lens of climate justice. And that's been a journey I've been on, particularly over the last 3, 4, 5 years. And I want to encourage you that even if you didn't start your journey within a church, or maybe that's where your journey started, it's a great place to do a bit of activism and to do a bit of stuff as an individual. Now, before I give you, I mean, I could just throw things at you that you could do to be a bit more environmentally friendly yourself. But I do want to first of all start off by saying that there was an incredibly disappointing, but it wasn't that much of a surprise statistic that was out that said that 100 companies globally produce about 71% of the global carbon emissions. So please just remember to not feel guilty about your personal carbon footprint. We can all do something, but let's remember that I'm not putting this all on you, so don't worry. But one of the things that we are is we are part of a system. We are part of the place that we live in, the community. For me, that is Glasgow. We're then part of bigger countries, Scotland, the UK, Europe, wherever you might be in the world. You are part of a system and you have an influence. And we all have a role within these places to live a little lighter on the planet, to live in a way that aligns with God's creation and this beautiful world that he has given us. I want to give you some suggestions of things that you could do. Hopefully these will just inspire you a little bit, because one of the things I've found as an activist is sometimes you just think, I don't know what to do. I'm learning all of this stuff. I feel like the news is really negative. Maybe you're feeling a bit hopeless. And actually, sometimes I just want to go and get stuck in and do something about it. You know, one of the things I've loved in lockdown is being able to go on so many lockdown walks, the daily walk in lockdown. And me and my family started to get really frustrated at the litter that was around our local area. And one day we just thought, why don't we just go deal with it? Let's just deal with it, get it out of the way, put it in the right place, put it in the bin. And now we enjoy our walks. And sometimes the climate crisis, the climate emergency is sometimes a little bit like that. Sometimes it just feels like we're getting bogged down with information. And of course we should be hearing this, but there's always stuff that we can do. And sometimes it just feels good to have a refresh, go and do some things and take up some actions. So now's the part where I'm just going to throw some things at you. And I do the tactic, if I throw a lot, something will stick, like a pack of cards. And if we all just take away something, there's 92 people on the call. So that's 92 potential actions that people can take. And they are all things that we can be doing. One of the funny things I decided to do in 2020 was a New Year's resolution. So my journey as an environmental activist, the Less Waste Laura thing, started as a New Year's resolution in 2018. So every year I try and do one. And in 2020, I did it, you'll be so proud. Mine was to not fly, which was probably easier said than done. Well, no. So in 2020, I committed to not fly, and then I don't think anybody really flew anywhere. But actually looking at our transport and the way that we get about is a great way that we can start. I know that Graham, who works for Tearfund Scotland, was telling us that he has only filled up his car once with diesel since the beginning of the pandemic a year ago. So if you have a car, or if you like to take flights on holidays, you've probably seen that there is a way of living a little differently. Maybe the way that you get about, the transport you have, is something that you can look at. Maybe it's about getting a bike. I've been thinking about getting a bike, thinking about my commute once we finally get to go back to the office, about incorporating a bike instead of a car. And so transport is a really great way that you can think about your personal carbon footprint. And maybe that extends to your family, going on a staycation, something fun like that. We've also spoken a little bit about food and food systems, food that we might have in our churches. But one of the big conversations I often find is around what is the most sustainable diet or the sustainable food. Now this changes globally because around the world, different foods are grown in different locations. But there is one thing we can say for certain. The worst food for the planet is the food you don't eat. Food that is wasted around the planet. I bet people were waiting to see if I said something controversial there, but no, it's food waste. Globally, a third of food is wasted. And if food waste was a country, it would be the third largest emitter around the world. So we all have a role to play when it comes to food waste. We've got this great new thing in my fridge. My mum's actually on the call. Hi, mum. So we have this great thing in our fridge where we try to do this shelf that is the sort of got to go now shelf, where it's the food that you think that definitely needs eaten ASAP. Let's try and cleverly incorporate it into a delicious meal to really manage our expectations and say, actually, what's in our fridge is food that we've been provided with. Let's make sure we eat it all up. It's also about silly things like picking single bananas in the supermarket because those get left behind and get turned into food waste. It's about diving into the reduce section to save that from going to food. So think about food and the food that you waste, because that is a great place, again, that we can all do it. A challenge for you, we started to get creative with food waste recipes, and we made banana peel vegan pulled pork. So you sort of shred it up and fry it up with barbecue sauce. It's delicious. So maybe that's something you can get creative with. Also, we've heard about heating churches, but also we can heat our homes. Think about not turning on our heating straight away, thinking about ways that we can maybe switch to a renewable energy source. There are so many things that we could do within our home. Think about insulation, all of these really boring things that actually are super important for saving carbon emissions in our homes. We can also think about fashion, about re-wearing fashion. I don't know about anyone else. I've not bought a single new thing in lockdown for clothing. I'm enjoying wearing out my clothes. I'm enjoying finding new things that were in my wardrobe. And fashion, I've had to learn how to sew, and as someone who's left-handed, I really can't get it, and watching videos is not helpful. But actually thinking about our fashion and our fashion waste, hopefully you're starting to build up a picture that I'm just waffling here with lots of ideas, that there's so many different things that we could take up. I do want to end with two final ones. The first one is to remember boring activism. Now, what I mean by boring activism is, for example, if the government of the country that you live in puts out a consultation and it feels like it's pages and pages long, answer it, get your voice heard. If there's something that is happening from higher up, that might not even be a government, it might be a local shop or a business, asking for your feedback on the way that they are being sustainable. Make your voice heard, say something, spend the time to be able to really, really respond. And this goes for reaching out to your MP, speaking to local businesses. You have a voice and you should definitely use it to try and make that impact. But my final tip before we go into a bit of Q&A with the rest of the speakers is to use your sphere of influence. Every single person here has a sphere of influence and it is completely different from anyone else's. You've got the people who you share a house with. You have the people on your many, many WhatsApp group chats that we all probably have now. You have people in your churches, your home groups, maybe your youth group. You've got your neighbours, your local community. You've got people in your sports team, your colleagues. You also have people who follow you on social media. And whether you have 10 followers or 10,000 followers, or you have 5 people in your church or 500 people in your church, these are all people in your sphere of influence. These are people that you can have a conversation with. And there's an amazing TED talk by Catherine Hayhoe, who is an internationally renowned climate scientist, talking about one of the biggest things we can do for climate change is have a conversation. We can have a conversation about how we can do things differently, trying to change somebody's mind or start a conversation, do some learning together. And so I would love for you to just think, where has God placed you in this world? Where are some of those conversations that you can have? And what are some of those things that you can try and talk about? So use that sphere of influence. Thank you. I will, pass back over to Alistair.
Thank you, Laura. My goodness. If you thought there was nothing you could do, then hopefully the last 10 minutes have convinced you otherwise. Laura's given us a flying overview of many, many topics. We've posted a link to her website in the chat box where you can dive at your leisure into many of these things in much more detail. So we'd encourage you to do that. And someone was asking the question, are we sharing these slides? I think the answer to that is yes, we'll share the information from this event to those who've signed up. So so we'll perhaps be able to share that, that website also. We now have an opportunity to ask the panel a question, and there's a few of those already appeared, but please don't be shy. Come forward and ask your questions. I'm going to kick off with one question, which in some ways is really is quite basic, but actually quite difficult. And the question is simply this: what do we actually mean by climate justice? What does that what does it mean, or maybe what does it look like? Might be another way of framing that question. So Father Chitty, I wonder, would you like to start giving that an answer? What would climate justice look like in the place where you live and work and minister and amongst the people that you serve?
Let me suggest just one way of looking at climate justice, and I think it has already been highlighted by my two colleagues. When you look at the contribution of emissions into the atmosphere, the regions of the world that contribute the most will be in the north and in the west, the UK, the US, and so on. The regions that contribute less will be in my part of the world, in Africa, in maybe Latin America, and in South Asia. But the impact of climate change is felt mostly by people in my part of the world. So we pollute less, we emit less, but we are the ones that suffer the most from the negative effects of climate change. So if we're going to talk about climate justice, then I think first and foremost, we have to recognize our responsibilities, our individual, collective, national responsibilities towards the crisis. And in this respect, I would say those that pollute the most, those that emit the most of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere should acknowledge their responsibilities, their moral responsibilities, and act on them. It could be, as we've been discussing now, it could be working towards reducing carbon emissions by adopting various ways that have been suggested. It could be working for the reform of our laws. I'm familiar with the work of SCIAF that have engaged the Scottish government to set a target for zero net emissions. It could be networking with like-minded groups. I think a lot of that happens in Scotland as well. Could also be helping poorer communities that are bearing the brunt of climate change. So that could be something that could be done by people who live in the part of the world where they contribute the most to global warming and climate change. It could also be to help those who suffer the most by contributing towards coming up with mitigation measures or adaptation measures. You know, I referenced that community in Chikwawa. You know, their lives have been impacted negatively for what will be a long time, because they have to rebuild their lives, they have to rebuild their communities, they have to rebuild their livelihoods, and they will need help. And that's why I talked about some of these commitments that come out of these big conferences, because if they're saying we'll make available about $100 billion, I think it is, every year to help those who suffer the most from climate change, that should be seen to be happening. And those resources should reach those who suffer the most from the climate change crisis. So I think for me that's one aspect of climate justice that I can think of, acknowledging those who have contributed most to where we are, and also trying to do something on a personal, community, national level, as well as reaching out in solidarity to those who are suffering. Thank you.
Thank you. Shauna, would you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to add that, you know, I suppose it's like trying to view the climate crisis through a kind of political and ethical lens. And lots of times we have heard about, when we talk about the climate crisis, we often talk about animals and the physical impact on the land. And we often sometimes don't focus fully on the impact it has on individuals and communities. So it goes back to that fact of, you know, who is suffering the most because of this, who is causing it, and how do we change that balance, how do we fix that? Because at the moment, as I say, as people in the global north and the west who are, you know, consuming so much, and through that consumption indirectly, you know, causing, you know, something like, is it 60 football pitches are cut down every day to make way for farming land, and that food tends to go to the global north and not to the communities in the global south where that degradation is happening. So it's just trying to consider how political decisions can achieve climate justice and, you know, tackle climate change. It's not just, you know, I suppose it goes back to, I think what Laura was kind of saying about system change and not just individual change. You know, there are big systems at play here that have made so many inequalities, you know, almost immovable for some people. And that's not just, you know, poverty and things. It is in this instance, you know, climate crisis is affecting migration and forcibly displacing people. It's about considering how all these things are made worse by the climate crisis, and the people who are suffering the most are, as we've already kind of heard, is by the people who've, you know, contributed the absolute least to the issue.
Thanks. Thanks, Sean. I think a number of you talked about this big word that we use in our sector called intersectionality, which just kind of means that actually lots of justice issues collide, and we know that climate change affects women more than it does affect men. Within countries, it affects people who are already struggling and marginalised. So it's certainly part of a bigger kind of justice picture, isn't it? Laura, anything that you'd maybe want to add in terms of what you understand climate justice to mean, or what you see in your mind when you think about climate justice?
I think the intersectionality that you've just brought up is key. And I think it's important for us to also think about just the language that we're using. You know, I think there's been a real shift in talking about climate change to now talking about a climate emergency or a climate crisis, because we know that it's urgent and it's happening now. But I think the importance of including that word climate justice is because I think just because of the way we've spoken about it for years, we think of climate change being ice caps and forests disappearing and animals, which are all very, very important issues and all issues that play into this. But sometimes we do forget that people element to it, and we do forget that intersectionality, that people we care about, because we care about refugees, we care about people, women's issues and gender-based violence, and we care about all of these other issues. We sometimes forget that climate change is being put on top of that. And, you know, we know that, for example, we've seen COVID pushing people back into places of poverty and vulnerability. We know that's also happening with climate change as well. So it's important to see this as a justice issue, as it links with everything else, but also because of speaking about it as a justice issue, that pulls it into the theology of justice and God's plan for justice. And it's not this other thing, it's actually the heart of God's story and the plan of restoration.
Thanks, Laura. I'm going to come back straight to you, Laura, with a question that somebody asked you. You mentioned right at the end that one of the most powerful things we can do is talk about climate change, and actually the influence we have because we've all got networks. And the question is simply this: how do we start? Where do we start? You know, perhaps within our let's talk about our churches, because that's the topic. But you know, where do you begin as an ordinary church member to kind of begin a conversation to get people who are understandably talking about COVID and lots of other worries that are going on in their lives? How do we begin those conversations?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a great question, and I'm glad it's come up. I think one of the things that you will hear at the end is that we have between the organizations sitting here and other people, so many resources. These are great and great for starting that conversation. And sometimes it's just about finding that in. So maybe the in to having the conversation is finding out how it links to a subject or a passion that somebody already has and saying, actually, let's bring in another element, let's talk about this. But maybe to give some examples of how you could bring it into your church. For example, I think the research that Tearfund did with Youthscape has already been mentioned. If you want to bring this up in your church, maybe you have a youth worker or you have somebody who runs some youth work, pull them aside and say, I'm wondering if we can have a conversation. I've seen this research that's happened. I'd love to go through it with you and talk about what this means for our young people or for our church as a whole. Or maybe you don't have many youths, but maybe you want to do something with other members of the church because everyone cares about climate change and should. So maybe it's saying, actually, Hazel will say more about this at the end. Can we use this small church resource group that is a film series about climate change to start having a conversation? Is this something that we could do? Or maybe it's even more basic than that. I know that one thing I did with my church here in Glasgow a couple of years ago now was actually ask a question about the fact that we were using 15,000 single-use plastic cups a year, and that wasn't great for the environment. And we started with having one conversation about, can we change this one thing that is now led to catapulting that church into a world of looking at environmental issues deeper and on a much bigger scale. And so sometimes it's just about finding that little place to begin with. And because climate change can sometimes feel quite overwhelming, one of the really important things that we could do as an in is just to pray about it. To say, as a church, I'm feeling this thing is on my heart. I think God's put this on my heart. I think he's put it on the heart of many other people. And I want to stand in solidarity with our global brothers and sisters. And I want to first just pray about this. That is something that you can do in your church. That is something that you could host. That is a thing that you could start up. I mean, we're all on Zoom prayer groups, I think. You can also reach out for other people to pray with. I'm part of a monthly global prayer meeting called the Climate Intercessors, where we just sit and bring things at the feet of Jesus and pray about it. And so all of these things are just ways in. And also what you could do if you're really struggling is get in touch with one of the people that's on the panel and say, hey, can you come and talk to other people with me? You know, can you come with me and talk to my church leader or talk to my youth or whoever? Because that's, yeah, really what we want to do to start that conversation. That goes for businesses as well and all the other places. Just have a conversation, just start, be bold, and bring others with you.
Thanks, Laura. And I'm glad you mentioned the role of prayer, because I think that's a question I know a number of us have been thinking about, which is what is the distinctive and unique role that Christians can play in this? If you think about climate change activism as a jigsaw, what is the space we occupy? What is God asking us to do? And so I'm just interested, perhaps if Father Chitty first, and then Sean at next, if you'd like just to kind of share any thoughts that you have on the kind of importance of prayer in this topic, and any kind of pointers as to how we might do that well.
So thank you. I often like to think that those of us who are members of faith community, like Christian community, that our greatest resource is our faith. We already talked about or referenced teaching from scripture, like our creation and so on. So I think that the starting point is there. Do I believe that God created the world in such a way that all members of the earth community should enjoy the best that there is, that all resources and goods of the earth should be equitably shared by everyone, and that in our lifestyles, do we often consider, future generations, so that, my lifestyle does not compromise the ability of future generation to have a similar living standard of living, questions of sustainability. So I think faith for me means that I'm in constant dialogue with God and with my brothers and sisters who share the same faith. And that dialogue, that conversation takes the form of prayer, personal prayer, community prayer, liturgy, always trying to open my mind and my heart to God. When I referenced the little theological activity I did at the beginning of my input, I said, we're trying to listen to God in the same way that God spoke to the Hebrews, especially in very challenging times, when they were in Egypt or when they were in Babylon, when they experienced hardships. They opened up to God and they asked God, what are you saying to us today? So in a similar way, we could say to God, what are you saying to us today in the light of the suffering that's coming out of climate change or COVID, as the case might be? So that conversation, those questions we're asking, that's prayer. But there's also a type of prayer that brings members of the faith community together that we call liturgy. We go to church on Sundays or whenever we do. We join our brothers and sisters again in opening up to God, trying to listen to God speak to us as a community, as a nation, as an interest group, again, as the case might be. Very often when God speaks to us, he will give us a mission. He will ask us to do something about what we're looking at, about what we're studying, be it poverty, be it climate change, be it COVID-19. God will always say, I need your hands, I need your brains, I need your legs to intervene and change a bad situation to a better one. I think that's where I see the role of prayer, the role of liturgy in any undertaking of this nature. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for reminding us that prayer is a two-way conversation, and it's not just what we're asking for, but what we may be asked to do. Shauna, any reflections from you on how prayer features as part of your activism and how perhaps we can pray into this issue?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I really love about prayer is I think when you're just kind of growing up in the church and learning about it, you think it's got to be done like in a certain way, and there are obviously certain ways that make it maybe more reflective or more peaceful. But the one thing I love about prayer is I can do it anywhere. I can do it any time in the day. I can just take a minute and do it when I feel I need to, and it is something that I can, just speak to God and be like, this is what is currently worrying me or stressing me out, or this really cool thing happened and I want to talk to you about it. But also prayer can be such a source of strength. And I think when kind of, as we were talking about some of these climate issues and things, we are asking for quite bold action. And sometimes I know people are talking about how to start conversations. It can sometimes feel quite daunting to make that kind of initial inroad to making a change. And when I've tried to push the Church of Scotland to divest, conversations in that haven't always been easy, and they've been quite difficult, and it's been quite scary to stand up in front of hundreds of decision makers and tell them that they're not doing good enough and that they need to go further. And that's not going to always be something that people want to hear. So for me, prayer in my activism has encouraged me and given me strength to do things that seem really scary. But when I think about what Jesus did, then as I say, he didn't wait until people were ready and primed to listen. He just started speaking and said, no, you need to listen to this and you need to hear it now, not later on when you're ready. And I think prayer can be a real source of strength in that. And as I say, you can do it at any point in the day for 5 minutes or 50 minutes, however kind of you need and when you need it, which I think is great. So
thanks Shauna. There have been some questions in the chat box about the role that churches can play with COP coming to Glasgow soon. There will be, we'll be covering that briefly after our next slot, but I'm conscious of time, and we really wanted to make sure that there was an opportunity here for you not just to be listening, but also to be sharing your own experience. We're aware that there's a lot of committed, passionate, and experienced people here, and we wanted to create space for you to share some of your stories and listen to others who share the same interests. So for the next 10 to 15 minutes, we're going to move into a time of group discussion in breakout rooms. Our Zoom magician Tammy is going to make that happen seamlessly for you. There will be a kind of nominated organizer in each group who will be taking notes and feeding back on the end so that you can just kind of enjoy participating in a discussion. The time that we have will disappear really quickly, so if I could encourage you when you make your contributions to do so briefly and to the point. Let me just share the two kind of key questions that we want you to discuss, but we'll remind you of these when you get to your groups. Question number one, well, it's really an opportunity for you to share. What are you doing in this space? What have you tried? What would you love to try? What have you learned? What would you like to share? So it's an opportunity for you to tell a bit of your story. And the second question is, what kind of resources or tools would help you and your church to act on the issues that we've been hearing about? And that will be helpful, I think, for our organising partners as they think too about how they can support you to take this forward. So over to Tammy now, and we'll see you back here for a wrap-up session in 10 or 15 minutes. We're just going to have a quick opportunity now, a quick whistle stop around the breakout rooms, and our scribes are going to be sharing some of the most interesting points that came through. So I think I'm going to hand over to Fiona, and then if the rest of you could just go in sequence, that would be great. So let's hear back from some of that rich conversation.
Thanks, Alistair. We had lots of really great contributions in our group. Lots of resources that people are using in their churches and individually, which we'll share afterwards in the follow-up email. But we had a point around how this issue could be something that could be unifying from a theological perspective in terms of responsible Christian stewardship and discipleship. Could COP be something that the churches could bring us together around in Scotland? We also heard a bit about it being an intergenerational issue, so the impact on future generations in our own country and around the world, and our responsibilities to the next generation. And that led us on to discussing the just transition, benefits that will have to future generations, and some of the kind of spheres of influence that we have there with trade unions, for example, who are doing a huge amount of work supporting communities where change is happening. So that was the highlights from our group.
Thanks, Fiona. I was with group 2, and we started by saying that films could often galvanise people. A good example from St Andrews, who showed a Leonardo DiCaprio film, which is called Before the Flood, had 60, 70 people there, and on the back of that ended up with a citywide ecumenical green network, which have been working together. And then churches in Falkirk, even during lockdown, managed to do a sort of toy exchange and a uniform exchange with really practical ways to sort of reduce, reuse, recycle, and also serve some of the poorer people within the parish. And then there was examples of the sort of Catholic network on the back of Laudato Si and using that to get groups together. And then a good example in Glasgow as well, which ahead of the original COP had asked for people in the congregation to come forward and show an interest. And they had done that, and they've only been meeting online, but I've managed to use the Christian Aid prayer train once a month and to sort of pray about the issue on the first Sunday of every month, and also do a climate Sunday. So lots of really good examples of resources, prayer resources, film resources to get people talking.
I was group 3, and so some interesting discussion about how using the church land. So for instance, there's a church in Portobello, and they're actually using their church graveyard and they're planting vegetables there. And they weren't the other church, so there's other churches just talking about how best to use that land. One other church is using climate justice, using that phrase in worship as much as possible, shading stories. So it's again, just like wake up the rest of the church to the issue. And another big topic of conversation was using climate and the environment, issues that people care about, as a means to reach out to the wider community. And that way you can also further the kingdom of God and doing that. And one church had actually David Coleman come out to speak, but it ended up being so big, they've now got this bigger group that involves not just them, but the local community. So kind of community work and linking that. We didn't have much time left for tools of resistance. We basically had like 50 seconds. But one example was like the stories that are shared. So just being able to, storytelling is always a great way to make it real and for people to identify with. And then even things like local flooding, that connects it to ourselves. If it's happening to us, then we can understand it more. So we ran out of time, but the group was really great, and thank you to everyone.
Yep. Thank you. I was taking notes for one of the other groups, and that what really came out in our discussion was that this is a good opportunity for building links and networks with others. So one congregation suggested actually working as a network with other churches in the area or the region to host eco events and shared speakers. Another mentioned how it was a really good way for getting out of the church and into the community. They'd been active in a lot of community projects with trade unions and other grassroots groups in the area. And we spoke a lot about some of the different resources available. Some of the congregations have just started getting active on these issues in the last couple of years. And they found that kind of, you know, taking things bit by bit and gradually building up has been the best approach for winning people over.
I've got some feedback from another group as well. We had a minister who had taken the approach of having a kind of general overview of the entire life of the congregation. So they had to look at, for example, the coffee time, not using kind of single-use cups, and then the service time, how much energy were they using, and looking to reduce the carbon footprint of the church. And then another minister discussed that he'd done a 1 month long focus on the climate. So taking it as a kind of a month focus on some of these issues. And then in terms of resources, we had a lot of people giving their praise to the eco-congregation resources. They were found those really excellent, but the resource or tools that people thought that they would find perhaps helpful were resources relating to animal suffering, and then also perhaps some tools or resources to help churches look at the heating and insulation, as quite a lot of buildings are perhaps not fit for purpose in this day and age. So we had an interesting conversation about that.
Okay, we've got a really important message from our group was around sharing. So one great example was sharing stories to make it relevant to people about the changes they could make. So for example, on Saturday, United Reformed Church, sharing stories to make people see that being carbon neutral by 2030 was achievable, but also sharing stories with people you need to influence, MPs who maybe get an agriculture background, talking to them about the importance of climate change in agriculture and the farming communities in Scotland to get them to make the decisions we want to make. And one thing about resources and tools was literally tools, a tool library, being able to share things that are quite expensive, have to be made specially. Why are we doing that when we could just share as communities of faith and wider communities on those items? Instead of getting new ones, we could be sharing them all collectively. Thank you.
I think I might be maybe the last group, and I'll just say 2 points to keep it brief. The first one was really looking at how we can be part of a bigger movement, how we can look outwardly from our church and engage with the global church and campaign globally. And really the example of the Jubilee campaign was kind of used as a real example of just how we can stretch out the church across the world. And so that was really important. And the second thing, it was just great to hear from lots of different members of that group about what God's put in their hands, both as an individual and as a church, whether that is using a church garden to somehow do something for the community or using their building in a green way. And so I think that was just a really important way that people were saying that they could just use what they have to really glorify God and his creation. So that was great.
Thanks, Laura. Have we captured everyone? Is there anyone still waiting to go? No, I think we're there. Fantastic. Sounds like a really rich conversation in such a short space of time. So just before we finish, moving on actually to some of the fantastic resources that are out there, we're just going to give each of our organising partners an opportunity to tell you about some of the amazing stuff that they've got, some of the great tools and resources that they can use. So I think I'm going to hand over to Flick first at the Climate Coalition, and then we'll take it from there. So Flick, it's over to you.
Hi there, hi everyone, great to be here. Thanks so much for having me. I'm Flick, I work for Friends of the Earth Scotland. I'm currently based in Glasgow. I have been working and kind of leading on logistics for the COP26 coalition, and we are kind of the umbrella coalition that is building the civil society response to COP26 happening in November. COP26 is going to take place from the 1st to the 11th of November, as many of you will be aware, and we are planning a lot of activities to, from mass mobilizations in the streets, COVID dependent, of course, to putting on events, creating a real festival to really push our governments as much as possible to deliver climate justice. I'm here with a couple of asks, actually. So I head up logistics in the COP26 coalition, as I said, and I'm sort of busy sourcing venues from many activities that we've got planned. And I'm also sort of trying to build the infrastructure to host and accommodate the thousands of people that may well descend on Glasgow in November. So I have a bit of an ask, both at the church level and then also individually for everyone here, for those folks who are living in and around Glasgow. At the church level, I would love to hear from you about any venues you have, any kind of kitchens that you have, any facilities that you have that you could offer to support us for the great many activities that are happening. So that's the first thing from the churches themselves. And then the second thing is, we are asking everyone and as many people as possible in and around Glasgow to host travellers, activists, delegates coming to Glasgow for the COP26 activities. And we're setting up an online platform, a little bit like Airbnb, but specifically for the climate and ethical, and it's all about connection. So we will be asking everyone to sign up to that, to host somebody coming in November for a few days or for the 2 weeks, and kind of play your part to accommodate this fantastic event that's going to be taking place. Thanks very much. I'll put a couple of links in the chat about that, but I think I'm handing over to Jonathan next.
Hi everyone, and thanks for inviting us along. My name is Jonathan McAvity and I'm the Senior Campaigns Officer at SCIAF, which is the International Development Agency of the Catholic Church in Scotland. So I've got 2 quick ways for you to play an active role in this really important year for the climate. First of all, this was mentioned by Father Chitty and someone else in the chat box earlier on. We have produced a guide called Care for a Common Home, and it's really to inspire you to take action in your parish or in your family to care for the planet. If you download the guide, you'll get lots of tips and advice for cutting your carbon footprint in a number of ways, including your energy usage, travel, the food we eat, and reducing our consumption. I will post a link to that in the chat box. And the name comes from Pope Francis's Laudato Si encyclical, which tells us that change starts with us and that we need to lead by example and make lifestyle changes. The second way that you can get involved is by making your voice heard in the debate around the Scottish Parliament elections. We can't wait until COP comes in November to start campaigning for action on climate change, because the politicians are already making big decisions and writing the manifestos that are going to set the agenda for the next 5 years. So SCIAF has teamed up with Stop Climate Chaos Scotland and some of the other organisations on the call today to ask the next Scottish Government to increase funding for international climate justice. You can start having conversations with your local candidates ahead of the election on 6th of May, asking a question at one of the many online hustings events that will be taking place, or even reaching out yourself to ask for a 15-minute virtual cuppa over Zoom, just to let your local candidates know that climate change and justice for the world's poorest are really important issues in this election. And if you want any ideas or support to get in touch with local candidates, then you can contact me at campaigns@sciaf.org.uk. And I'm going to hand over to the next organisation now.
That's me, it's Hazel from Tearfund. So one resource that I thought might be really helpful, because if like me, you're keen to reach out to those people within your church that don't think climate change is a priority, we've produced a 9-part film series on Christianity.
Well, Hazel, you knocked yourself onto mute. If you can knock yourself off.
Sorry. Sorry about that. It's a film series, 9-part film series with internationally renowned climate scientist Catherine Hayhoe. She's really clear, really understandable. Doesn't matter where, if you're an eco warrior or a newbie, and you can do it as a house group, you could come together, and it's a good way to get others in your church along that journey. Do it as a house group, go through all 9, go through some. It comes with discussion questions, and it's just a good way to maybe get more people involved. If you come to one series in your house group, you could start this one. And it looks at all kinds of topics. It looks at climate change through the Bible, it looks at fossil fuels, how to speak to other Christians, how it impacts on people in the global south. So I got a lot out of it, and I work on climate change every day. So I do think it's like a really great resource that you can get quite excited about. And the second one is the Climate Emergency Toolkit. Now, this is something that Tearfund and Christian Aid and Eco Congregation with others have put together, and it's to take your church on a journey. And it's quite a lengthy journey, so it starts with just talking about climate change, and then all the way through to making a declaration, a climate change declaration, and then how you can do political activities and do influencing. So taking you on this big journey. And if you download the toolkit from Tearfund's website, on the 22nd of April, we're hosting a Zoom, and you automatically get an invite to that. That'll take you through the toolkit and help you to get it up and running if your church feel that's something that you could do with your church. And the final thing, and both Shonach and Laura have already mentioned this, is Tearfund's Burning Down the House report. And it surveyed 630 young Christians aged 14 to 19 about their thoughts on climate, the church and faith. And the survey found that 9 out of 10 young people are concerned about climate crisis, but only 1 in 10 thought that their church was doing enough about it. So it's interesting. So if you can download it again from our website, and that'll just give you insights and to think about how maybe you can engage your young people more. So that's just 3 resources. We're just flinging resources at you, but I'll just pass you on and get in touch about anything, and if we can do anything else to help, let us know.
Thanks, Hazel. I'm Stephen Curran from Eco Congregation Scotland. We're an ecumenical charity supporting churches all over Scotland, committed to environmental activities in their life and mission. We've currently got 512 churches registered and growing. There's so many people motivated to act in climate justice in this year of the COP26 climate conference coming to Glasgow in Scotland. So what can you do? 2 simple things. If you're not a church registered with us, please get registered, get involved. Go to our webpage, ecocongregationscotland.org, I know there's a number of people in this call are very much amongst the volunteers who lead the work in all our churches. So if you're already active in our movement, apply for an award. The awards recognise growing environmental activity, making a huge impact in your church congregation and increasingly in your wider community on aspects of spiritual, practical and global living, because you need all those aspects to really address the climate emergency. So if you go to our website, ecocongregationscotland.org, you can also sign up for a regular newsletter. Every week we send out a newsletter. Most weeks we've got an event. We're also sharing the fantastic events with other organisations here, and particularly the Climate Fringe from Stop Climate Chaos Scotland. Fantastic focus on COP26 being here later in the year. We're in social media, and we also have the presence of the Eco Chaplain, an environmental chaplain called Reverend David Coleman, who is an ecumenical chaplain who's been acting very much as a visiting digital preacher with individual churches, but also providing online resources through our social media in advance of church services every Sunday. Two key resources we've got for this important year. One is a simple 2-page briefing that says on one side, what is COP26? And on the other side, how can you get involved in terms of worship, action and advocacy? And that's ecocongregationscotland.org/COP26. And it's updated at least once a month because things are changing very quickly and new activities are coming on board for faith communities to really get involved, not just in Glasgow, where it's important. We've got churches coming together to support the COP and have an offer of hospitality and welcome, but all over Scotland, we can make a real difference in climate justice this year. We've also got monthly theme resources called Let's Talk About the Climate Emergency. They focus on a key aspect of the environment each month, which could be energy, it could be about weather change, it could be about something that's very specific in your community that you want to talk about. So that's where we would pray, talk, and decide how to act on those issues in the communities where we live, that local action responding to the climate justice issues around the world. And the final point to make is something that Shona mentioned in her presentation. Climate Sunday is a fantastic initiative for churches together in Britain and Ireland to hold a service at some point between now and September, the start of Creation Time or Creation Tide in our churches. Commit to local action in your church to cut those carbon emissions in your congregation, in your own household, in your wider community, and speak up, call on the government, particularly UK government hosting COP with the UN, to act. It's a fantastic year for us to really make a difference and get people motivated. I'm looking forward to working with everybody again. Thank you. I'll hand over to, is it Fiona that's coming next? Yes.
For some reason, the PowerPoint won't move on, but I'll highlight a few Christian Aid ways to get involved this year in around climate justice. So I work at Christian Aid on campaigns and advocacy, and there are 3 key resources and ways to get involved I'd like to share. The first is a film called Thank You for the Rain, which tells the story of a smallholder farmer in Kenya who has used his camera to capture the life of his family and the human cost of climate change. And this film is available as a catalyst for planning a collective response to the climate crisis. So you can hold a watch party and discussion in your church. It's available for free if you get in touch with us at Christian Aid, and it's a great way to start a conversation around climate. We also have a climate justice petition that's just launched, calling on the UK to increase financial support to the world's poorest countries. And there will be similar petitions and campaigns launched throughout the year, both for at the Scottish and UK government, so that we can put pressure on decision makers around climate this year. And finally, our COP26 prayer chain for climate justice is up and running, with participants signed up already from across the UK and internationally as well. So we encourage you to sign up to the prayer and action chain as an individual or as a church. And we're planning a culmination event of the prayer chain at COP in Glasgow so that we can show decision makers the strength of the faith voice for climate action. So just a few ways to get involved, and really all look forward to working with you over the coming year.
Thank you, Fiona. Thank you all. What a treasure trove of resources. So we've come to the end of our time together. Just to say, we will again share those slides, so you get all of them, including Fiona's points there. We'll share all of those with you after the event. How to sum up? Clearly, this is a massive issue of our time, a huge injustice tangled into a web of many injustices, something that I hope you all feel now we can do something about, something I think as Father Chitty reminded us God is calling us to do something about. I'm certainly taking away from this the importance of rolling up our sleeves and doing the important theological work that's necessary here. Excited by the opportunity that this issue gives us for increased Christian unity and also for witness in our community. I hope you know today that there are practical things that you can do in your own life each day, but I hope you're also challenged to go beyond your own individual lifestyle and to think about how you can influence those in your peer groups and those beyond. We have an election coming up. We've got a very significant conference coming to Glasgow. It's frankly shocking that the £100 billion pledge for climate justice to support countries that are really struggling, that was committed at previous COPs, has not yet come to fruition. I'd encourage you to pray into that, and I'd encourage you to speak loudly about that issue as COP is coming to town. And finally, just to remind you that there's a lot there to help you. You're not on your own. Please feel free to contact any of the folks who've spoken, and do make use of the great resources that they have shared. So all that remains is for me to say a huge thank you to our fantastic panel members, to Father Leonard Chitty, to Seanette Knox, and to Laura Young. Thank you to our organising partners, to Tearfund, Christian Aid, SCIAF, Eco-Congregation Scotland, and Stop Climate Chaos Scotland. Thank you to our scribes. Thank you to Tammy and Fiona for making this all work so seamlessly. But finally, a huge thank you to you for your interest, for your concern, and for the action that we know that many of you will be taking in the coming weeks and months ahead. May the Lord inspire, encourage, and equip you as you serve him through acting on this important topic of climate justice. Thank you, and goodbye.
Do some of the people involved want to stay on for a few minutes? Great.
Good work. Good work, everyone. That was amazing. Says me as an audience member, not having put any effort in whatsoever.
It's not like you, Kat. It's not like you.
It's all down to Fiona and Tammy's. It's all about the work beforehand, isn't it? That makes these things work well. So yeah.
All about a great planning document.
I always feel comfortable with a good planning document.
Yeah. Yeah. Well done, Fiona and Tammy. You really both did so much work. Really do.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
For
Thank you.
taking part, and speakers.
Yeah.
Well done.
One thing I thought was that there were so many good resources going into the chat there. People were connecting with resources that we hadn't necessarily even mentioned, and we didn't know about necessarily. I think I already texted Tammy to say, can we kind of record all that and somehow have a little bit on our website? We could have a specific, we've got a resources section of the website. We could have like a specific bit for churches, and then, you know, as more resources come through for different themes and sectors, we can add those as well. But this just seems like quite a well-resourced area at the moment.
Yeah, there's a lot to share.
Definitely. And if you could all send further resources, I know that Alistair and Stephen, you were both privately and Laura sending me links in the chat. So if you want to send more before I send a follow-up email with everything, all the resources, then please do. That would be great.
Great.
Thanks, Tammy.
I think one thing that wasn't really space to discuss, but I'm really interested in is, you know, and clearly we're still very unsure about what shape COP's taking, but in a normal COP, Glasgow would be full of representatives from the, you know, civic society in the global south, including a strong Christian representation. And, you know, it would just be lovely. It would be lovely to think that there might be opportunities to give platforms and space and voice to people coming from the global south in our churches and in our services around that time. And I'm just wondering if, I guess it's difficult to plan. Well, I mean, maybe we can plan a virtual strand of that, but wouldn't it be lovely if for the couple of Sundays around COP, you know, hundreds of churches had, you know, what was it, the phrase you just used, Seanette? It was our spiritual siblings or something from the global south, but actually had them leading us in worship or leading us in prayer or sharing their stories or sharing their testimonies. That just seems like an opportunity that waiting there to be made use of in some way.
Yeah, there's plans for an ecumenical service during COP, which would be open to everyone. But I don't think there's been anything coordinated around actually kind of almost pairing up churches with people from the global south who might come and speak at them. I've not heard that discussed in any of the kind of church or faith spaces. Stephen, I don't know if you have.
Yeah, it's been encouraged, but a lot of it's through the natural connections people have already got through the aid charities particularly. But it's something there's a specific Glasgow group which is looking at how do we encourage the greater Glasgow churches specifically with the hospitality welcome. And an important part of that is making a connection, because people might not travel here eventually. So you make the connection on the off chance they're traveling, but you actually have that conversation with them, and hopefully it's about sharing the story that these parts of the world that are most affected are able to share, like Father Leonard today. So I think a lot of the uncertainty around the event has made it a little bit more challenging, but I mean the work that Kat and Flick have been doing has been really helpful, just saying to people we are planning for something and we've got contingency to cope with any eventuality with that as well. So I think that's a really good suggestion though. We should make that, flip it around, so it's a service which is the global south with us attending. I
should probably jump in to say that one of the things that Tearfund is organising just now is a virtual service for Sunday the 7th of November for COP, with the idea that we're wanting churches to all use this service, and it is going to have like a Scottish twang to it, but it's very much a global thing, and so that is something that we are hoping to offer churches, and we want one of the speakers to be from the global south to bring that element in, and then to have voices in a big collage at the end, from all around the world. And that's one of the things that we really want to push. And so I guess it's one of those things like, when do you promote it? It feels a bit, so it's something that we've been working on and we are writing a blurb for just now. And so that's probably something that we can definitely share around the networks, because we want churches, because I guess one of our thinking was if COVID wasn't a thing, there would probably be a big moment in Glasgow, which there hopefully still will be, and that would be it, and everywhere else sort of gets ignored. Whereas we're realising that now, with churches having so much experience with hybrid or online, actually we can engage the global church or the UK church in a conversation around COP and climate change at the time. And so that is something that